everyone, and welcome to this episode of Talk Wildlife. Today we're going to be talking about how to responsibly feed foxes in your garden. And the most important point to make about this episode is that we're not trying to encourage anyone who isn't currently feeding foxes to do so. This is more geared towards people who are already feeding foxes or planning to and won't change their mind about that regardless of what we say. So we're going to discuss a couple of reasons why we wouldn't encourage doing so if you're not already, but how to do it the most responsible way you can if you are doing it. Right, so let's go ahead and talk wildlife. This is something you deal with quite a lot in your business, Kevin, isn't it? People either phoning because they do feed foxes and they have questions about it, or more commonly, someone phones saying their neighbour's feeding the foxes and it's annoying them because the foxes are coming up to them. Well, I guess they also contact you a lot of the time not knowing that their neighbours are doing it.
Yeah, it's usually the last one which I think occurs most in mainly urban fox conflicts. So what will happen is I'll get a phone call with saying someone is experiencing a fox coming up to the back door, coming up to the window, coming up to them in the garden, just sitting almost at their feet, waiting for them to give them a treat. I mean, at the time, the people don't know that's what the fox is trying to do. But once I start investigating it, Flo, and talking to them about it, you can start seeing that these foxes have almost been tamed by people giving them food, and then it's kind of overspilling. So the people who are feeding the foxes and kind of taming them, whether they mean to or not, these foxes are moving on to somewhere else who maybe not like foxes, and suddenly they've got a fox which has been very brave and confident around them, which unnerves people.
Yeah, you've got to be really careful about your neighbours' views. And I've read about a pest controller who had 35 years experience, and he said that every call he had ever had somehow involved a neighbour feeding foxes, and then he goes along and shoots the foxes. So he even admitted that it's because of people feeding foxes that the foxes he deals with get killed.
It's quite funny if you think about how this all begins. So someone would feed the fox because to them it's a magical wildlife experience. And they feed the fox at the back door, they try and feed it from their hand. And although they think they're doing that fox a favour, and hopefully they're doing it because they think it's benefiting the fox, not because they're doing it for their own reasons. But what they don't understand is, if you get a fox to take from your hands or do a little trick for you, and he goes next door or 4 doors down, and it displays the same behaviour to someone who's scared of foxes, and those people don't call me or, Humane Wildlife Solutions or Foxagon or Fox Solutions, the non-lethal alternatives to pest control, then that fox is probably going to be killed and shot, all because someone wanted to feed that fox.
Other problems include over-reliance, and foxes could even end up having so much food that their territories shrink and then you get more in one area. Also, it can annoy neighbours in another way, because if you give a fox loads and loads of food, they'll end up caching that food, potentially in your neighbours' gardens, and then they come out one morning and they just find the garden all dug up in bits of food that's obviously come from a human, just, lying around everywhere in their flower beds and things like that.
Yeah, again, that's really common. And I remember a case only a few weeks back, so this would have been in December 2020, where someone had up to 8 foxes at certain times in their garden, and the foxes weren't there for the person who had them in the garden. They were hanging out there because the neighbour was feeding the foxes. So this just shows what Flo just said is true. So when these foxes was getting such a large amount of food, so many foxes gathered together, even though naturally they would not tolerate each other that close in such small proximity. But because there was such an abundant food source being given out by this neighbour, all the foxes quite happily waited their turn. And you often see the photos of foxes almost lining up, waiting their turn to get some of the food.
There's also problems if you're planning on moving house or going on holiday, and the foxes are relying so much on the food source that you're providing, and that suddenly goes away, they can struggle. So if you are going to feed foxes, and again, this is an if, we're not encouraging you to do so, but if this is something you are doing, you may want to think about cutting down the amount of food you're giving them, so that it's almost like a supplementary part of their diet, not something they're relying on, just something that can help them a little bit.
And by doing that gradually over time, what you'll find is the fox will start looking for alternative food sources. So if you were feeding the fox every night and then you cut that down to 3 times a week and then down to 2 times a week and down to 1 time, the fox it's going to find natural food within its territory, and it will find those natural food sources, be it worms, be it natural berries, be it rats, mice, or even pigeons.
And further to contacting pest controllers, people who aren't happy with foxes in their gardens, who they suspect are being fed by other people, sometimes turn to poisoning meat themselves and putting it out for the foxes to eat. So you really, really need to make sure that you're not doing anything to annoy your neighbours. The best way to do it, if you are going to do it again, is just to feed them right at the end of your garden so that they in no way associate that food with a human. So they're not going to approach people or people's houses any more than any wild fox who doesn't associate them with food.
Yeah, because unintentionally taming a fox, you're putting that fox's life at risk. Although it's safe in your garden, a fox's territory could be 20, 30, 40, 60 gardens. And if one of those people within that territory of that fox has a bad experience, they want that fox gone just because someone's fed it and overtamed it, you need to take into consideration the way you feed that fox. And you need to feed, if you're going to feed foxes, you need to feed them responsibly.
That's the reason why you might not want to, or should I say, you shouldn't, in my belief, be feeding foxes in shared gardens either, because you don't know what your neighbours are going to think of that. Or even if you do know that your neighbours are okay with that, what if your neighbour moves out and is replaced by someone who isn't happy with that happening, and they have a problem with it, and they can see the fox in their garden and they're either terrified or angry and they're going to get something done about it? You're not always going to know if you put out food for a fox if it will definitely be a fox that comes for the food. You could get badgers, hedgehogs, mice, rats. If you want to avoid any animals from eating the food, probably most likely rats or mice, because those are the ones that don't seem to be welcome in people's gardens all the time. You just need to pick up the food remains so that there's nothing lying around at the end of the day. Or, I mean, when do you think the best time of day would be to pick up the food remains? Would you have to do it first thing in the morning, or?
Well, to be honest, if you're feeding foxes...
If there's remains and you're doing too much, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, if you're feeding foxes and there's food left over, because a fox would typically catch the food if there's an abundance of it. They naturally would do that anyway. If rats are being drawn in or mice being drawn in because food left over, the fox ain't going to go chasing a rat if there's a whole cooked chicken sitting in front of it. It's going to take the easy option. But if there's food left over, it will bring the rats in. If you want the rats to go, you reduce the feeding, and the fox might try and go for more natural food sources and chase the rats and mice, which in turn would deter the rats and mice from being in your garden around the food.
So if you are feeding foxes, a way that you can use this as an educational tool to make more people like foxes is you can get your family involved. In normal times, you could get them over to watch the foxes if you have, say, a window or a glass door that you can watch them at the end of the garden from, or put up a trail cam, a camera trap, so that you can see not just the foxes you're feeding, but if it is even foxes you're feeding, because you might find badgers or hedgehogs or something else. And if you do find rats, rats are great too, and they need to eat as well. But it is just a possible chance that your neighbours might not be so happy with rats. Just like they might not be so happy with foxes, you'll need to think about if it's best for the rats if they're coming somewhere where they might be seen by other people.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked myself out of countless jobs where people call me up and saying they've got foxes in the garden and they're worried about the foxes there, and they're worried for their children or any disease risks. And once I've spoke to them about it, and this is more geared around foxes making dens in people's gardens under sheds or decking or even in the soil. But once you educate people, I find, Flo, about foxes and what's going on and how they behave and how they're not a risk to people or their children or generally their pets, then that's when you start to see or even hear on the phone their attitudes changing, and you can turn that in, like you said, into an event where when COVID wasn't a thing, people would go around and invite their grandchildren over or invite their family over or even their neighbours over to come and sit in the evening and watch loads of fox cubs play around the garden.
I was going to say, you sometimes suggest to people to put out slippers or dog toys so they can watch the cubs.
Yeah, cubs absolutely love stealing shoes. It was that job I done once in central Scotland, and this guy lost like 8 pairs of trainers, but there's only one of the shoes of the pair had only ever been taken. And when we looked under the shed, there, right enough, there was all these shoes, and there was cubs there, and they had been stealing his shoes off his back doorstep and running away with them. And it was quite funny. But I do love a good play with things like that. And I mean, if you think of them, they're just like puppies, I guess, in that kind of sense.
Yeah, if you have foxes using your garden, you can put out things for them to play with without even feeding them, so then you're not worried about the risks that come with feeding foxes.
True, but then you might also then be encouraging them to steal people's shoes off the back doorsteps.
But it doesn't have to be shoes. You could be putting dog toys right at the end of your garden, couldn't you?
Yeah, that would work nicely. I mean, they're inquisitive animals anyway. They love to have fun. Giving them a toy to play with. And again, like Flo says, at the end of the gardens, you don't want the toy to be associated with you giving it to them. You want them to almost think they've found it on their own naturally.
So whether you find that you're feeding hedgehogs or badgers or foxes, the best thing to do is to feed them at the same time of day, every day, or every evening even, so that they know when the food's going to be around and so that you're not leaving it lying around for a long time. This is why trail cams can come in handy, because then you might see if an animal you don't expect is there, or if it's sitting around for a lot longer than it should be, you can maybe change the time that you're putting the food out.
Yeah, well, remember when foxes go around their territory, they'll go to all the places where they know they can get food. So if one person's feeding a fox and someone else is, the fox will usually visit those people in the same order, roughly about the same time. So you may not even be first on the fox's stop-off list if he's going to go and find some food. He might go to someone down the road first and then come to yours. And he might not even eat your food, he might just end up cashing it. But they do their routes and they usually do them at the same times.
You think your fox is number one, but actually it's your neighbour down the street, it's your foxes. Brooke just stole a bit of pancake from her box. We made the jackdaw's bird-friendly pancakes, blackberry pancakes, and she just stole the last bit, which was meant to be shared by both of them, but that's fine.
Yeah, that's Brooke.
She sits on the edge of her box and she looks at what we're doing. Like yesterday we're doing a jigsaw and she sat right at the end of her box. So I put a square on it and I just wrote, was it Nosy Station?
Nosy Station,
Nosy
yeah.
Station, where she sits if she wants to be nosy. Or steal pancakes. So that it's easy to clean up any crumbs that might be left, because there might still be little bits of food that the foxes don't get, crumbs. Put the food in bowls or in a tray or something like that so you can just clean it up at the end of the day or at the end of the feeding session. And always make sure, if you're giving them a tray or bowls or whatever it is they're eating out of, make sure these are clean and not chipped in any way that might cause damage to the fox, like if they cut themselves on it or anything like that, because obviously that could cause problems for the fox or lead to infection. I say fox, could be badger, could be hedgehog. And don't feed anything that's dangerous to a dog, like chocolate or, I want to say grapes. I'm assuming grapes are bad for foxes as well.
Yeah, I should probably, actually no, I've sure heard of stories of foxes stealing grapes from vineyards. I'm sure I've heard of stories about this.
I was also going to say cooked chicken bone, but I read somewhere that cooked chicken bone's actually okay for foxes. But basically just research what's safe and what's not, and try not to overfeed on anything too sweet or fruity that might be bad for their teeth, because foxes are known to have quite bad dental problems, and if you're putting out food which might attract other animals like badgers and hedgehogs, even more reason not to put out things like fruit, because fruit's really bad for hedgehogs and again it can affect their teeth. You don't want to be putting out things like mealworms or peanuts, because these are actually quite bad for them as well, though they are really commonly fed. So the best things are, dog biscuits, cat biscuits, wet cat or dog food, although dry food might be better in summer when it's hot. Some people put out eggs, raw or cooked.
Yeah.
And, sorry, I was going to say water. Always leave out water, because pretty much every animal benefits from water in one way or another. Just make sure the water's nice and clean, it doesn't get full of droppings or too dirty, and crack the water if you can in case it gets frozen. But even, winter, summer, spring, autumn, animals benefit from a bowl of water being in your garden.
Yeah, I was going to say the eggs is a really good one, because it's foxes would take eggs naturally anyway from bird nests if they can find them, especially on ground nesting birds. But then you don't get that many ground nesting birds in urban areas. Mm-hmm. But they're also foods that the fox can stash away for another day. And like Flo said, water is really important all year round if you're able to do it. And again, with the food bowls, even water bowls, make sure you clean them regularly, just to make sure, there's not going to be any harmful bacteria or germs building up on the food bowls.
Other than just listing a few points that we've made already, I don't really have anything else to say for this topic. I think it's a bit of a short and sweet episode, but the point is just to give some people advice if they're going to be feeding or are feeding foxes. So do you have anything to say other than the last points?
Yeah, I would. Remember, when you're feeding a fox, you need to be responsible for it. You need to understand what happens to that fox after it interacts with you, and how the interaction could change that fox. And by that I mean how your interaction could tame a fox. And remember, once that fox leaves your garden, it's still got those imprints in its mind that people and food is a good association. So be responsible. Never feed a fox out of your hand or at your back door or at your window. Always do it far as way down the garden as you can. Somebody you can observe from your window or even standing by the back door, but don't ever feed a fox from your hand. It's irresponsible and it puts that fox at a lot of risk.
Yeah, it can seem magical for you, but living in the real world, being realistic and responsible, it's not the right thing to do.
No, it's definitely not. I mean, pest controllers themselves even say people feeding foxes is the main call out they get for shooting foxes.
Yeah, like that guy I was just talking about.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you really love a fox, you wouldn't tame it up or get it to feed from your hand, because doing that, that fox is more likely now going to be shot by a pest controller if it annoys one of your neighbours, and then that will be on you.
And it won't necessarily be one of your direct neighbours. You might know the neighbours who are closest to you, but it could be one or even more than one who are even further away than that. So just because your immediate neighbours are okay with it or love the foxes, it doesn't mean that the fox won't be at risk from a neighbour a little bit further away who you may not even know about. So Kev, imagine we have a house in a town and we have our own private garden and you see foxes walking around every now and then. Would you feed the foxes?
I probably would, but right at the end of the garden, and I'd put the food out well before the foxes come round. So I'd learn their route, what time they come by, put the food out so they almost accidentally find it. But then again, I wouldn't feed them every night.
I was going to say I'd do it sporadically.
Yeah.
Maybe twice a week or maybe if the fox... The thing is, right, the benefit of feeding foxes, other than obviously you're feeding foxes, is that if the fox becomes injured, it can be a lot easier to trap them because you just put the food you usually put into a trap that you can get from a wildlife rescue centre, for example, and the fox will recognise the food and be more likely to get caught. But yeah, I think I would probably feed them sporadically, but if I had a really small garden, then I wouldn't risk it.
No, not if it's too close to the house. But I mean, with the sporadic feeding is really good. And you could put food out maybe twice a week on different days. And that way, in fact, you're going to see more natural behaviour from the fox. Because if he checks every day and doesn't find food every day, he'll still search your garden. So you'll get a time where you'll be attracting this fox to your garden. He knows there's food some days, but he's not clicked on what day that food is. And that's good, because now he's not got that time association with your garden. And like I say, I can't stress enough how important it is to be responsible when feeding foxes, because if you overtame a fox, you're putting that fox's life at risk. And I don't want people to go, stop saying that, or be angry what I'm saying, or think I'm trying to take the fun away from you. I'm actually just trying to make the point, and I see this year after year with my business trying to help people with fox problems. And I'll probably say about 6 out of 10 of the jobs is because someone's been feeding a fox and has tamed it. And if that person hadn't have called me, they would have called someone to have that fox shot.
And they're not people who hate foxes. They're just genuinely terrified sometimes, aren't they?
Yeah, they're not educated on the way foxes work, their behaviour and their psychology. And sadly, a lot of people keep referring to baby attack stories, which we know are not true. But that's what sticks in their mind, that there's a fox in the garden, oh, my child's in danger, I'm going to have the fox shot or killed. So, I mean, I guess that's not in relation to feeding foxes, because that fox could be travelling through anyway. But just be responsible. You know, I'm not saying don't feed the fox, but if you're going to feed a fox and you want that to be something you do, and you're like, I'm going to feed him anyway, I'm not listening to this guy on this podcast, but do it responsibly. I'm all for that.
I think what you said is relevant though, because it's the fear of foxes, even though it's unsubstantiated, but it's the fear of foxes that make people more likely to go down the culling route because they're actually scared of them. It's like when you get clients who have a problem with foxes, or so they say, but the only problem is that the fox is walking through their garden, and so the problem isn't actually with foxes, it's with the fear that's been put into their minds.
That's a really good example, yeah.
So I think if I was going to say to you it's okay to feed foxes, I would advocate for sporadic feeding. Nothing that's going to cause any sort of over-reliance or allow anyone else to know when the fox is going to be in the area, because a direct neighbour who maybe has a gun or is a pest controller or knows a pest controller or calls out a pest controller might know the exact hour pretty much, or that fox is then going to be in their garden as well.
Of course, yeah.
So the main points I want to make is if you're going to feed foxes, don't overfeed them, Don't cause over-reliance or even reliance. Don't allow humans to become associated with any food. Don't attempt to tame any foxes. Don't feed foxes by hand or from very near your house. And don't feed them any unnecessary or unhealthy foods like sweet things or kind of very processed sugary things. Anything that you think could be bad for them. But, have a look online, not just anywhere, but some good website like, I don't know. Let me have a look at just now.
Although we've raised many negative things in association with feeding foxes, there are a lot of positives too. Foxes are the best form of urban pest control. They'll keep your gardens rat and mouse free. People get really magical up-close experiences with foxes as well in their garden. And if a fox is not well or is injured, then someone feeding a fox, like Flo said earlier, can actually help in the process of catching that fox and getting it the treatment it needs. So there's lots of benefits to feeding foxes. But once again, be responsible about it and think of your fox. Think of where's your fox going to go after he's been at your house. How is he going to take his learned behaviour from his interaction with you or her interaction with you to somebody else? And would that behaviour then put that fox at risk or in a dangerous situation?
The foxproject.org.uk has a good webpage about feeding foxes. It's just called Red Fox Diet, but it mentions feeding foxes as well. So you can have a quick look at that if you want. They say that it's okay to feed foxes peanuts. It's more hedgehogs I'd worry about with peanuts because they basically can deplete them of calcium. So if it is hedgehogs that are coming, you want to avoid them. But yeah, just dog meat and things like that. But that's a good webpage if you're looking at it. Because I was just going to say that if you aren't sure if something's safe for foxes, you can always have a look online, but don't just trust any website. Make sure it's some sort of official organisation or something that you know that you can trust.
Yep, and I totally agree. The Fox Project is probably the best place to go for anything regarding foxes. And that can be for what to feed them, just learning about them. Good reference material you can probably find there. And even if they need help, that's probably the best place to go to ask for help for foxes. And not just that, I work closely with the Fox Project, and when people have troubles with foxes, 9 times out of 10 they're on the phone to the Fox Project, and then they'll be put through to someone who offers a non-lethal alternative, so foxes don't have to be harmed at the end of the day.
Actually, that reminds me, I think it's the Fox Project you can contact for mange treatment, isn't it?
They will direct you to the correct people who
so
have it, yeah.
If you have a fox that you think has mange, and again you can look online for pictures of what mange looks like, then if you're feeding them, that's a great opportunity to actually medicate them against the mange that they may have. So if you ever have a fox that you're feeding, you think it might have it, you can contact the Fox Project, and as Kevin said, they'll put you in contact with the right people. And you'll need to pay for the treatment, but if it keeps your fox in inverted commas, safe, then I think it's totally worth it. So that is another benefit potentially of feeding foxes, is that they're easier to catch if they're injured, they're easier to medicate if needed. Although I have had some calls through Wildlife Rescue, people asking if they can give wormer that they once had for their dog to foxes and things like that, and I wouldn't at all suggest doing that because you don't know about the dosage and you don't know certain medications might affect them differently and things like that. So I wouldn't go medicating foxes with anything other than the mange treatment, which you've been given specifically for that purpose. But if they do have mange, then at least you know there's something you can do about it.
And just lastly, enjoy the foxes. They're an animal which are demonised in the media and all too often. So really enjoy them. And when we're at this horrible pandemic situation, when COVID's no longer affecting our communities and our loved ones, invite your friends over, invite family over if you've got foxes in the garden, and let them enjoy the magical sight of a fox in the garden.
From the distance.
From a distance. In your house, through the window.
Not in your house.
No, not no fox in your house. You and your family and friends in your house, looking out your window at these amazing creatures. And look, if you're lucky enough to have foxes raising a family in your garden, wow, I'm jealous. I work with them every week. I wish I had foxes in my garden. But just remember, be responsible in feeding them so you don't put your foxes at risk.